First presentation is by Vimal from the University of Cape Town. The topic is Inequality Traps and Human Capital in South Africa. I want him to present, then I'll mention other people as we go along. So the time strictly 15 minutes, not more than that, but you can take less than 15 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in because I only have at most 15 minutes. So this is work which I did with my colleague and friend Michael Pellither, who's now in Germany, but he was at UCT with us not so long ago. And a structure of the presentation, we're going to talk about the question and then give some of the context of the South African environment, and then some of the theory that helps us to think about what we're trying to understand, and then some of the data and discussion. So the question that we're asking is South Africa in an inequality trap on the human capital dimension? And so we're going to define in the next slide what's an inequality trap, and we're thinking particularly of human capital, and in particular the dimension of human capital that is embodied in schooling. So, and then we're going to ask, because there's different models, there's several different models in this literature, and we're going to ask, can we kind of separate between the different classes of potential inequality traps? So, in terms of background, so we saw, David and them spoke yesterday, that South Africa has a very high Gini coefficient. There's a range of estimates from different people, using different data sets, using different methods, different imputation techniques. And you would place this range somewhere between 0.5 and 0.7. It's also been a highly unequal society for a very long time, but our data, our reasonable household data, starts in 1993. And so from our first point of measurement, which is 93, to now, it's either increased or remained stable. And it's really high. So there is a bit of an economic debate about the trends, the levels, what's been happening. But we kind of circumvent it in the sense that we say, well, it doesn't matter who you find more compelling or which method you find more plausible. The thing is, it's really high, right? And it has been high for at least the last 2 decades. It's also now explicitly part of our government's policy areas. And we care about this because on 2 different levels. One is just a distributive justice issue. When you live in a very highly unequal society, you ask these questions about, is this a moral distribution of resources, or is it right? But as an economist, we also ask about whether it's efficient or not. So there's 2 different ways of thinking. The first is that you need some incentives in order to get people to work hard or to take on risky investments. If there's no possibility that you can earn big rewards, why would you take on big risks, right? And that would be true for local investors or foreign investors. And so if you want to get your investments right, then you also need to think about how you incentivize this. And if you incentivize it with high rewards, then necessarily you're going to get high inequality at the end. In that case, inequality is an outcome of the incentives, right? But there's more recent theories which have challenged the view that you need to have high inequality to get efficiency. And they've pushed forward these ideas that inequality can be inefficient because certain people get excluded from good investments. They're too poor to invest, they can't get the credit, or they can't participate in certain political processes, and they get excluded, they lose their voices in a political sense. And there's many different theories as to why high inequality could destabilize an economy and hold it back in terms of its potential development or growth. Okay, so what do we mean by an inequality trap? So it has multiple requirements. The first is that it's a situation of high inequality, which results in, if we just conceptualize as 2 groups, rich and poor, the poor are unable to participate in some type of investment. And the small group of relatively wealthy people can, and so they participate in this profitable investment, and they get richer, and the poor are excluded, so they can't get richer. And then this results in a dynamically stable situation, right? So you've got, it has high inequality, it's dynamically stable, and something about the inequality results in a replication of itself in a temporal space. It could be intergenerational, but it could also just be within the same cohort over time, right? Okay, so we considered 3 models. And the first is a model of perfect credit markets, where if markets are perfect and everyone has the ability to borrow for good investments, then we won't end up with a trap. Because everyone who's got a good investment opportunity, whether they're rich or poor, will be able to finance it somehow. Okay, so there's no trap in the dynamic sense because the poor will then slowly engage in profitable investments. And in the imperfect credit markets world, you get a trap due to market failure. So the poor people don't have credit history, or they don't have collateral with which to share, so they have to pay higher interest rates. Sometimes they can't get any credit. And then eventually they get excluded. There's some margin of poor people who can't participate at all. And then it's partly that they stay there, which looks like a poverty trap, but partly that the small group of rich people do it, and then it's the scarcity of their investments. So they're the small group who holds a small number of these investments, which are really valuable then because of the scarcity, because the mass of poor people are excluded. And it's this interaction between the rich and poor and that scarcity eventually that generates the stability. Okay? So those two, the first two, the perfect credit markets and the imperfect credit markets models, those are actually mutually exclusive hypotheses. You can't have both simultaneously. The third one, which is the social externalities, and this is a very different one because it's not working through economic mechanisms, it's working through social forces, such as peer effects, such as neighborhood stratification, such as bad schools in particular areas. That one can exist regardless of which of the first two exist, and it could complement things, right? So it's a slightly complex situation because we're not having a clear A or B, we're having A and C, or B and C, or not C and A, those type of things. Okay, and then we're focusing particularly on tertiary schooling, but it applies to any form of human capital investment, and moreover, it would apply to any type of investment, which requires some type of access to credit or savings or capital, or collateral even. Okay, so we're going to use 2 different data sets. One is the National Income Dynamics Study, Wave 1, which was in 2008. And the other is the Cape Area Panel Study, again, Wave 1, which was in 2002. David and Murray talked about it a little bit yesterday. And we're going to look at returns to education, who studies, who does not study, and the reasons for not continuing with studying. And that's trying to separate between the perfect credit markets and the imperfect credit markets hypothesis. And then we're going to look at role models, educational expectations, and career aspirations. So the second stuff, that bullet point, we're going to use CAPS. The first bullet point, we're going to use NIDS. And a little bit of evidence on how it actually kind of manifests. Okay, so the first thing, for us to build a story, we need to show a few things. We need to show that returns to education are very high. And then that people would want to study, and then that poorer people can't because of financial constraints, right? So these are like different points in the story which we can actually look at empirically, because it's all just theory otherwise, and we tried really hard to think of whether we could test it. We can't precisely test it, but we can test little predictions in the story. Okay, so the first thing is, how high are returns to education? We did something very simple. We took the group of young people who, if they had done college, they'd probably just finished with college, in NIDS, and we asked what fraction of them are employed, and if they are employed, what's the mean income? And that gives us a sense of returns to education. And it doesn't deal with a number of econometric issues, but it does give you a ballpark figure. So if you look at the people without a matric in the South African language just means high school degree, high school graduation. So if you don't have a matric, you're a high school dropout, then only 43% of them are employed in the 25 to 29-year-old cohort. And the average income is about 1,200 Rand a month, which at current exchange rates would be about $120 per month. So if you think that there's some chance I might get a zero income because I'm unemployed, and if I do get, I'll get on average 1,200, my expected income is 534, which is about $50 a month. And so the thing that, so if you look at the employed column, you'll see that as your education level goes up, you're much more likely to be employed. So it goes from 43% to 57% to 73%. And so it's going up quite steeply. And then if you look at the mean income conditional on being employed, it again goes up quite substantially because it's doubling in each case, right? It goes from 1,200 to 2,600 to 5,500. And so in each case, it's approximately doubling even if you get a job, and you're more likely to get a job, such that when you go to the final column, you get that your expected value for having just a high school is 3 times as high as being a high school dropout. And then it's about 166% higher if you've got some type of a tertiary qualification. And notice that they were collapsing the group who have just gone to college or done a short diploma or degree, or those who have done bachelor's or a master's. Everyone's in that group. So there's almost surely even steeper returns from like 4-year degrees, etc. We just don't have that many observations in that group. Okay, and then, so then the next thing is it the case that your income level strongly generates the likelihood of you going to some type of tertiary schooling? So what we did was we took the household income per capita and we cut it into 5 quintiles. So 1 would be the poorest, 2 would be the second, 3 would be the third. And we asked, okay, so amongst young people in these households, what's the mean attainment rates of some type of tertiary qualification? And if you look at it downwards, let's start with the first quintile, you see that the rates are relatively low and they remain low as people age. So it peaks at just below 10%. And it's 10% at age 24 for the second quintile and the third quintile. And then it starts to go up. So in quintile 4, you're at 15.7%, and then it doubles in the top quintile to 31%, right? So you're seeing a strong flat, 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 and then some increase, and then a doubling in the last group. And that kind of makes sense for someone who works in South Africa because those groups 1 through 3 are all what I would think of as poor, and then somewhere between 4 and 5, depending on how you conceptualize this, you'd get a small middle class and then a relatively affluent group in the top decile, really. Okay. So the take-home point from the slide is that there's a very clear educational attainment gradient in the 5th group, and it's much, much flatter in the bottom 3 groups, and then the 4th group is a bit like in between. Yeah? Okay, so we've shown that returns to education are high. We've shown that attainment is the conditional probability of attaining tertiary schooling is a function of your quintile, of your parents. And then we ask in the questionnaire of those who were not currently schooling and why are you not? So there's several reasons. The 2 that I would focus on was the 3rd row, which is I could not afford it. And relating to it are the rows in 2 and 4, so the one above and the one below, because those are also economic reasons. I was looking for a job or I had to go work, right? And what we find in row 3 now, could not afford it, you'll find that the first 3 groups, there's a substantial fraction of people who were not enrolled, who say they were not enrolled because they could not afford it. And then it goes down in quintile 4 and then down further to 10% in quintile 5. So again, it's the reverse mapping by quintile. The poorest groups, about 1/3, say, I couldn't afford to carry on studying. And then in the last group, you're just at 10%, right? And then if you take this row 4, which is I was looking for a job. I've got 2 minutes, oh my gosh. I was looking for a job. And you'll again find the poorest groups. I'm trying to recalibrate here. The first groups are most likely to be not studying because they're looking for jobs. Okay, so this is the first conclusion. Returns are very high. Attainment is strongly correlated with socioeconomic status. Financial reasons do matter, and they matter in the way we thought they would. And so we argue that we reject the perfect credit markets hypothesis in favor of the imperfect markets. So we do think we're in an inequality trap of the economic dimension on human capital, right? Okay, I'm going to go much quicker here. So if we look at aspirations now, what did people who are adolescents and teenagers think they would? Do they think that they'll get a tertiary qualification? And if you just look really quickly, everyone thinks that they will. Not everyone, but most people. And so it's not an aspiration story. It's not that people don't want to study. It's when they're younger, they think they will, they think they'd like to, but they somehow, we know exposed, that's not the case, right? Okay, so what we did, this is the last set of slides. I mean, there's 3 of them though. So in CAPS Wave 1, there was a literacy and numeracy test, which was relatively simple and finite. I mean, it had a few questions. And we can compare people's scholastic aptitudes at that point in time, right? So what we did, because it's a smaller data set and we didn't have as many data points, we cut the distribution into low, middle, and high. Instead of 5 quintiles, we've got thirds, right? And we were asking the question, so this is of younger people, right? They're 14 to 16. How does their scholastic aptitude look conditional on whether they're in this low, middle, or high groups? Where if you're to the right, that's better. So if you can see, the graph of the upper income group, which is the top third, lies clearly to the right of the middle group, which lies clearly to the right of the bottom group, right, at the same ages. So the rich kids, or the richer kids, are definitely have a higher scholastic aptitude at this moment in their lives than the middle group, and then the poorer group. And now, just let your eyes relax a bit. I'm going to do it for the 17 to 19-year-olds and the 20 to 22-year-olds, but by the same groups. And what you'll get is a sense of how these distributions shift as people age, right? So that's our kind of measure of learning or development, human capital development. So the next one is 17 to 19-year-olds, and the next one is 20 to 22-year-olds. Let's just run through that again. Pick one of them. Pick poor or pick middle or pick high and just follow it. It's on the same axis and everything. There's young, slightly older, and then older. So if you look at it slowly, the thing is that the middle group and the low group, they look more or less stable. They're not actually shifting as these cohorts, as you go into older cohorts. But the rich group, now just follow the rich kids, they start piling up towards the upper bound of the test. The test was finite and small, so there's an upper bound. The highest number you could get was just slightly below 2 in the standardized format. And so what you find is that the rich distribution starts to pile up on its upper bound. It gets much more close to as high as you could get, whereas the other two really don't seem to be shifting. And so this is kind of one of the problematic things. So in terms of the social externalities, there are no large differences in expectations, but large differences in scholastic aptitude, which become more pronounced with time. And that could be because there's poorer schools, poorer resources, or because neighborhoods are not conducive, or both. We can't separate these things out. What you can say is that aptitude distributions look different when they're younger and evolve differently. Okay, so one last point is then we looked at career aspirations. And the thing is that, well, what's interesting is that first we created this and then I used a cutoff of a few percentage points. And nowhere in here is teaching, right? So there's this row teaching professional in higher ed, but nobody is saying they want to be there was a category for primary and secondary school teachers. But fewer than 10 respondents, young respondents, said that's what they want to be when they're at age 30. Or that's what they plan to be, so it's slightly different. And so we think that maybe this is part of a challenge of that teaching itself is not seen as a desirable career path. Okay, so this is really the last slide. I beg your pardon? Okay. So your standard policy responses, at least for economists, when you're thinking of inequality, are taxes and redistribution. And that can take the form of direct taxes and direct redistribution in the, like for example, Marie spoke about the grants. But you can also do it through localized public goods. You can invest in schools, you can invest in recreation centers or in infrastructure that goes to particular communities. You can also try to kind of alleviate credit market problems. And South Africa actually does have quite an extensive, it's called NSFAS, well that's not useful, but it's kind of like a federal grant system for students in need who want to go to college. But if you think of it a bit more holistically, there's two problems. One is this financial problem, but the other is that, as we showed with those pictures, a lot of students coming in from poorer backgrounds are not going to be able to compete once they finish school because of the difference in how human capital is accumulated through their primary and secondary schooling. And so it's a complex problem and it's very persistent, and maybe the right way to think about it is we need a multifaceted approach. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so since I've got to stay within time, I'm going to skip the outline and the introduction, and we go straight to the motivation. And basically what this is a study trying to understand the factors associated with home ownership in Ghana. It's taking off from an earlier study that we did, where we found that there was a gender gap in home ownership in Ghana, so we established that it did exist. So what we want to do here is to be able to find out the factors associated with it for men and women. And we also realized that, at least within the context of Ghana, we can consider ownership as having different dimensions. We have the reported owners. You go into a household, you conduct a survey, and you ask who owns the plot of land, who owns the dwelling, and you're given a response. So that is reported ownership. You can ask that of the primary respondent, the person who is answering the questions. You can ask that of the owner, him or herself. Then we have documented owners, where the individual is identified as an owner because the individual has a document. It could be title deed, it could be a sales receipt indicating that this person owns the particular asset. Then we have owners with rights. And when we made our presentation in Uganda some couple of years ago, this issue came up. What do you mean when you say somebody is an owner? The fact that this person is pointed out as being the owner may not necessarily confer on the person ownership rights. So that's the other dimension of ownership which we would look at, where does the owner have the right to sell, to gift, to bequeath, to use as collateral, or to transform the asset? So this is what motivated this particular study. So what are our research questions? Are the factors associated with home ownership the same for women and men? Do women and men have the same ownership rights? And which owners have the right to sell the dwelling in our particular context? And are the factors associated with ownership rights the same for women and men? So these are the answers, the questions to which we would want to find some answers. So if we should look at the data, our data is the Ghana Household Assets Survey. This was conducted in 2010, where the objective was to collect individual level asset data. The first time such a survey had been conducted, at least in Ghana, on a nationwide basis. So we have a nationally representative household survey, 2,170 households, containing over almost 8,000 household members. In terms of the survey instrument, it had two major sections. The first section was a household asset inventory, where we identified, we didn't work with the concept of the head of the household. we identified primary respondents and secondary respondents. And in the case of Ghana, we we asked who was most knowledgeable about asset ownership in the household, and that guided us in identifying who the primary respondent was. So this primary respondent, with the association of others if they were available, would provide information on the assets that were owned by individuals in the household and provided us with the identities of who those owners were. And indeed, if the asset was owned by somebody in the household and somebody outside the household, provision was made to be able to identify these people. So that was the first section. The second section of the questionnaire was targeted at 2 people in the household, ideally a couple, or else if we couldn't get a couple, a man and a woman. And the idea then was to probe further into ownership, and this is where we asked the questions about the rights. Do you have the right to sell? Do you have the right to rent, etc.? And we also asked questions on decision making. So we have 3,288 respondents who answered the second section of the questionnaire, including the primary respondent. Okay, previous studies there are lots of studies on home ownership, in the industrialized countries, not as many in developing countries. And most of the studies focus on the household. Does the household own, the dwelling? And there are different conceptual frameworks looking at the cost of renting versus the cost of owning, etc. But in our case, our interest is not whether the household owns the place of residence. We want to know who owns the place of residence. So what determines or the factors for an individual A or individual B in owning the place of residence. So in contrast to earlier studies, our unit of analysis is the individual and not the household. So we find that in the literature there are a number of variables that are introduced to try to explain the determinants of home ownership. Housing prices relative to rental values, we don't have that data, so it is not included in our model. And to be able to keep up to time, I won't go through it all. When I present the findings, then we can look at the variables. So as I've said, our unit of observation is the individual. The dependent variable is whether the individual owns the place of residence. In earlier studies, it's a question of owning versus renting. We can't do owning versus renting here, simply because we have information on who owns the place of residence. But we don't have, for those who don't own it, we don't know what their status is. Because the data in Ghana from the household survey, you find that individuals or households live in accommodation that is owned by the household, that is rented by the household, or that is rent-free. So we can't assume that if a person is not an owner, the person must be renting. The person could be living in the household rent-free, but we don't have that information. So it's just a binary one, taking value of 1 if the person owns the place of residence. We use a logistic regression, and we have 3 regressions looking at ownership for the sample of adults aged 18 years and above. Then we have a sample of adult men and adult women. And in contrast to previous studies, we introduce ethnicity variables because we think cultural norms and values and practices are also very important in determining whether or not a person will be owning the place of residence. Okay, so looking at our logistic regressions, what do we find? In terms of the entire sample, we find that women are less likely to be owning the place of residence, and this is significant. So we are confirming what our simple and descriptive statistics provided, that women are less likely to own the place of residence. We find that we have a nonlinear relationship for age. We find that the marital status is important, where our default is being in a consensual union. And you find people who are never married are less likely compared to those in a consensual union to own the place of residence. We also included variables to capture income stability, but we didn't have income stability data, so we make use of where the person works, where the assumption is that if you're wage employed, you're going to have more stable income compared to, for example, vulnerable workers, casual workers, domestic labor, and then compared to those not working, where our default in this case is the self-employed. So to quickly, how am I doing for time? Good Lord. Okay. So anyhow, if we should compare very quickly, what do we find? We find that there are some similarities and differences between women and men. We find that age is important and the direction is the same for both women and men. We find that marital status doesn't appear as significant in determining women's ownership of the place of residence, but it is important for the men. In terms of also our income stability measures, we find that they are not... We find that they are not as important for women as for men. The only variable that is significant is the vulnerable worker. And then we find that our cultural, our ethnicity variables controlling for cultural norms are important, telling us that women and men are not a heterogeneous group. And indeed, some women coming from particular areas are more likely to be owners of the place of residence than women from other areas. Okay, so that is looking at our ownership model. So we're now looking at the right to sell. Do all owners have the right to sell? And the answer is no. Or put it this way, well, we've got the right to sell, but the data that I have here is not only for the right to sell, it is for all the rights. And we ask questions of 4 rights. And no, not all owners have all the rights. And if we look at it from a gender dimension, we have 74% of the men owners having all 4 rights, compared to only 52.1% of the women owners having all 4 rights. Okay, Okay, so again, we have our 3 models, and then we have our explanatory variables. The dependent variable is a binary, which takes the value of 1 if the owner has the right to sell. And we have some more descriptive statistics. Basically, what we are observing is that you have a higher proportion of, for each of the individual rights, a higher proportion of men have the particular right compared to women. So if we should look at our regression, what do we find? Let's focus on comparing women owners and with men owners. We find that age is significant for men, not significant for women, although the age has for us an unexpected sign because we thought that age is privileged. How many minutes? 1, okay. Age is privileged in Ghana, so we would have expected that there would be a positive relationship. There is not for men. If you're an individual owner, if you claim to be the only owner of the property, you're more likely to have the right to sell. If you are the owner of a family house, we can discuss this later in terms of what we mean by the family house, but the family house is a jointly owned asset, and if you're the owner of a family house, you're less likely to have the right to sell. And then we find that, again, the ethnicity variables are important. We have 2 ethnicity variables important for women and 1 for men. So quickly, if I can round up in, let's say, 2-3 minutes. So are the factors associated with home ownership the same for women and men? We've found out that there are some similarities in terms of age and location, but there are differences in terms of the marital status and in terms of income. For marital status, our hypothesis is that the marital and inheritance regimes that we have in Ghana are such that they do not create any incentive for women to own the place of residence, and we can go into detail into that later on. Now, do women owners have the same ownership rights? We've said no. Which owners have the right to sell the dwelling? We've established it is the individual owners, irrespective of sex, and we found also that younger men are more likely to have the right to sell. Are the factors associated with the ownership rights the same for women and men? And we've observed that, yes, there are some similarities, and we've also found that there are some differences, and we find that cultural norms in particular, the marital and inheritance regimes, we think are very important in defining whether or not whether or not women are owners, and these cultural norms are also important in defining whether women will have ownership rights. So what are our recommendations? We think that at least among married people, we think that the introduction of marital community property would help in increasing the probability that women would be owners of the place of residence, and hopefully that would also translate to them not only being owners of the place of residence, but also having ownership rights. We have 2 bills that have been placed before Parliament. One has actually gotten approval from the cabinet. That's the Property Rights of Spouses Bill, and this is clearly going to introduce a marital community property. So our recommendation that is indeed, Parliament should get to it. It's been before Parliament for quite some time now, although there are lots of bits that are being debated, but it is something that we believe should be passed, as well as the Interstate Succession Bill, which is an amendment to the current Interstate Succession Act that we currently have. Thank you.
As the keynote address yesterday by Sam, David and Murray indicated, the post-apartheid period has been characterized by a really dramatic increase in pro-poor expenditure on basic services and infrastructure. And yet poverty rates, as you saw yesterday in South Africa, have remained stubbornly high, with only very modest declines, particularly post-2000, with the expansion, a very large expansion in the social assistance program. But not surprisingly, the government has been very critical of the measures of poverty which use money metric indices, arguing that income or expenditure measures of poverty ignore the non-income components of well-being, all grouped under what's termed the social wage, so access to education, nutrition, healthcare, housing, etc. Poverty studies economists have taken on the challenge from the government and recognize that income doesn't capture all aspects of well-being. And as we saw yesterday, people are starting to develop multi-dimensional indices of poverty. But money metric measures of poverty, income or expenditure, are limited not just because they don't capture non-income components of well-being. They're limited also because of how we measure income or expenditure. And the first problem is that capturing information on income or expenditure is difficult because this is very sensitive information to collect, and people are very reluctant to disclose how much they earn or how much they spend, and as a result you get what we call measurement error, so you get a number of implausible zeros, for example, where people claim that they earn nothing or they spend nothing. And you get non-response errors where people are not willing to report how much they earn or how much they spend at all. Another problem with money metric measures of poverty, which has received less attention, particularly in the South African literature over the last decade, is that people don't live alone, but they typically live in households where they share resources. And if there are economies of scale, and if children consume less than adults, then when we generate per capita measures of expenditure or per capita measures of income in the household, and if there are economies of scale and children consume less than adults, we're going to be underestimating access to resources in large households and in households that contain more children. So the objective of our study, broadly, was to look at an alternative way of measuring poverty based on people's subjective assessments of whether or not they think that they're poor. Now, there are a number of problems with subjective assessments, which I don't have time to talk about. I just want to highlight some of the advantages, namely that we don't have to make any adjustments for economies of scale or adult equivalents. People do this themselves when they assess whether they think they're poor or not. There's no reason why people would be reluctant to disclose whether they think they're poor or whether they think they're rich. It's far less sensitive information than disclosing how much you earn or how much you spend. Presumably, when people assess the poverty status of their household, they take into account not only how much income and expenditure they have, but a much broader range of well-being components. And we don't have to make any assumptions about what poverty line to use, etc. People make those assumptions themselves when they assess their poverty status. There's a very large international literature on subjective measures of poverty, but there's barely anything for South Africa, which is not surprising because we haven't had data on subjective measures of well-being in the past. But in the last few years, a new data set has been released, the Living Conditions Survey of 2008-2009, conducted by the official statistical agency in South Africa, which includes a direct question on subjective poverty. So our specific objective is to compare subjective and objective money metric measures of poverty and to ask what characteristics account for differences between subjective and objective poverty rates within the same household, and what then can we learn about how we construct money metric measures of poverty when subjective and objective measures of poverty don't overlap. So as I said, one second. So as I said, the data for the study come from the Living Conditions Survey of 2008-2009, where approximately 25,000 households or 98,000 individuals were surveyed. And there's a very nice question on subjective poverty. It's a very direct question. People are asked, would you say you and your household are at present wealthy, very comfortable, reasonably comfortable, just getting along, poor or very poor? And we identify people as being subjectively poor if they self-assess the status of the household as poor or very poor. And we identify people as being objectively poor, using a money metric measure of poverty in terms of per capita household expenditure. So we've used the per capita measure because that's been the convention in poverty studies in South Africa, particularly over the last decade, that everybody uses per capita measures. We use a poverty line that's been adopted by Statistics South Africa of an upper poverty line of 577 Rand per capita in 2008 prices, which is almost identical to the poverty line that we've all informally adopted over the last 20 years. Okay, so table 1 describes the overlap between subjective and objective or money metric measures of poverty. And what you can see is that there's a very high overlap between subjective and objective poverty status. 69% of all households have the same poverty status. In other words, they're measured as poor in terms of per capita expenditure, and they think that they're poor. Among households that are measured as poor in terms of per capita expenditure, 60% also think that they are poor. Among the 40% who are measured as poor but who don't think that they're poor, they're not responding that they are very wealthy or wealthy, but they're not responding that they're poor, they respond that they're just getting along. If we use just a lower poverty line, because South Africa brought out an upper poverty line and a lower poverty line, if we use the lower poverty line of 417 Rand per month in 2008 prices, we get an even higher overlap between objective and subjective poverty rates. So among households that are objectively poor, 64% also think that they're poor. Okay, table 2 describes objective and subjective poverty rates at the level of the individual and the level of the household. And what you can see is a very common finding for South Africa and other developing countries, that it really makes a difference what your unit of analysis is when you present poverty rates. So what you can see here is that 34% of households are measured as poor in terms of per capita expenditure, but that translates into 47% of individuals. In other words, 47% of individuals live in households where per capita expenditure is below the poverty line. And that is really because of the relationship between household size and poverty. Larger households are much more likely to be poorer households. When you look at subjective poverty rates, though, you can see that there's very little difference between subjective poverty rates, whether you measure subjective poverty at the level of the individual or the level of the household. And what this suggests is that the relationship between household size and subjective poverty is not as obvious as the relationship between household size and objective poverty. In table 3, describes this further, and you can see that as household size increases, so money metric poverty rates increase dramatically. Only 6% of all single-person households are measured as poor in terms of per capita expenditure, but almost 73% of all households with 9 or more members are measured as poor in terms of per capita expenditure. When we look at subjective poverty rates, they start high, they decline, to households of 4 members, and then they increase again, but not nearly as dramatically as they increase when we look at objective poverty rates. And as a result, if we compare subjective and objective poverty rates, for household size of up to 3 members, households are significantly more likely to think that they're poor than to be measured as poor, and this is reversed for households of 5 members or more, where households are significantly more likely to be measured as poor than to think that they're poor. So one explanation for this is that by dint of living in larger households, people feel richer. But another explanation is that there are economies of scale in living together which are not recognized in per capita measures, and as a result, particularly in large households, we are underestimating people's effective access to resources. A similar story emerges if we look at the share of children in the households. I'm just going to look at young children, but the same story emerges for older children. So as the share of children aged 10 or younger increases, so objective poverty rates increase dramatically. Subjective poverty rates also increase, but far less precipitously. So if we compare subjective and objective poverty rates, as soon as there's a share of children in the households, households are significantly more likely to be measured as poor in terms of per capita expenditure than they are to think that they're poor. So again, a possible explanation is people feel rich because they've got lots of children in the household, but another explanation is that children consume less than adults, and by using a per capita measure, we're underestimating access to resources in households where there are more children. Okay, a few more characteristics of households. We looked at subjective and objective poverty rates by geography type. I'm not going to explain all of them, there's no time, but what you can see is that in three of the 4 main geography types in South Africa, households are significantly more likely to think that they're poor than to be measured as poor. But the exception is in tribal areas, which are the former Bantustan areas of South Africa, which are on the periphery, where this is reversed. Households are significantly more likely to be measured as poor than to think that they're poor. Now, one explanation for this is that the tribal areas are geographically very marginalized. There's extensive poverty, and people might adapt to these conditions. And so because everybody else is poor around them, people don't think that they are as poor as they would be measured. But another explanation concerns a further distinguishing characteristic of households in tribal areas, and that is that they are the most likely of all households in South Africa to have access to land for farming. This farming land is really very, very small-scale farming. We're talking about subsistence farming largely, and that's why if you look at money metric rates of poverty or objective poverty rates, households that report access to land for farming are significantly more likely to be measured as poor than households that don't report access to land for farming. So these are poor households who are farming. When we look at subjective poverty rates, we find the same relationship, but it's less pronounced. So that if we compare objective and subjective poverty rates according to access to land for farming, then households that report access to land for farming are significantly more likely to be measured as poor in terms of per capita expenditure than to think that they're poor. So a possible explanation for this is that people feel less vulnerable to poverty if they have access to land for farming. But another explanation is that the returns to this subsistence agriculture are being underestimated in our measure of expenditure. In other words, that our household surveys are not doing a very good job in imputing the value of subsistence, of output from subsistence farming in our measure of expenditure. Okay, the final descriptive characteristic is whether or not the household owns their dwelling. And what you can see, which seems counterintuitive, is that objective poverty rates are far higher among households that report ownership of their dwelling than households that don't report ownership of their dwelling. And this is really because there's very high ownership of shacks in informal shack settlements, of traditional dwellings, mud and thatched dwellings in rural areas, but it also attests to the provision of low-income housing in the post-apartheid period. When we look at subjective poverty rates, there's very little difference in subjective poverty rates according to home ownership, so that when we compare objective and subjective poverty rates, households which report owning their dwelling are significantly less likely to think that they're poor than to be measured as poor. And what this suggests is that components of the social wage, or certainly access to housing, reduces people's perceptions of poverty. Okay, so we wanted to look at this in a multivariate context and ask the following question. What are the significant correlates of subjective poverty among households that have the same average per capita expenditure? Okay, I have 2 minutes. So we include a whole lot of variables in this regression, including the households per capita expenditure normalized by the poverty line. In other words, we're saying among households that have the same objective poverty status, what else predicts whether or not they feel that they're poor, or what else protects them against poverty. And if per capita expenditure was the only predictor of subjective poverty, then none of these other variables in the regression would be significant. Okay, so very quickly, we estimate 2 regressions, one with just household characteristics and one with characteristics which controls for the person providing this information. And we find that per capita expenditure is a significant protector of subjective poverty, but you can see by the stars that almost all the other variables in the regression are also predictors of subjective poverty. So just very, very quickly, we find what I showed descriptively, that as household size increases and as the share of children in the household increases, so households are significantly less likely to think that they are poor. So we wanted to get some idea of what economies of scale and adult equivalence parameters are operating in the household. And so what we did is, you have to take this off my time. We wanted to see what adjustments would we have to make to household expenditure so that in our regression, the household size variable and the share of children in the household variables would no longer be significant predictors of subjective poverty. And what we found is very large coefficient for parameter for economies of scale, a theta of 0.42, which is way more economies of scale than we have assumed in very early studies of poverty. We assumed a theta of 0.9. But the parameters for adult equivalent are very consistent with the assumptions that we used to make in earlier studies, where we assumed that young children consume half of the resources of adults, and we made no adjustments for older children. And what our estimations suggest is that there's an alpha of 0.5 for young children and an alpha of 0.9 for older children. In other words, they effectively consume what adults consume. Okay, very quickly, just a few things to highlight. We found that the share of pensioners in the household is protective of subjective poverty, even when we're controlling for the contribution of the pension to household expenditure, which suggests that social grant income is protective of subjective poverty beyond its contribution to household resources, perhaps because of the reliability and the stability of this regular source of income that people receive every month. We also find that access to assets are protective of subjective poverty, even very modest assets such as whether the household owns kitchen or dining room furniture, as well as whether the home is owned. But what really matters is whether the house has brick or block walls, in other words, whether it's a formal structure, and whether the household has access to services such as piped water on site and electricity. Okay, there are a number of other findings that are worthy of attention in the paper. I can't talk about them, but just to say that our results are robust, nothing changes, no signs change, we don't lose significance. We gain a little bit of significance when we control for respondent characteristics, and the way the respondent characteristics are associated with subjective poverty is largely consistent with what's found in the literature elsewhere. So in conclusion, we find a considerable overlap between money metric and subjective measures of poverty. 60%, much larger than has been found in international studies outside of South Africa, and that's because I think we have a much better question on subjective poverty. Where the measures don't overlap, it's partly because money metric measures of poverty are not capturing the multidimensional nature of living standards or the non-income components. But our results also suggest that it has something to do with how the money metric measure is measured in the first place. And in particular, the results suggest that per capita expenditure measures underestimate access to resources in large households and in households with more children. And it's likely that there's certain aspects of expenditure that are not being adequately captured in surveys, particularly the returns to small-scale activities such as subsistence agriculture. So the implications for poverty measurement in South Africa, our results suggest that the social wage is highly protective of subjective poverty. It really, access to basic services and infrastructure reduces people's perceptions of feeling poor. Social grant income contributes to subjective poverty reduction in addition to its effects on money metric or objective poverty. And finally, issues of economies of scale and adult equivalence deserve more attention in future poverty studies than they've received in the past, and similarly the returns to small-scale activities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inserting me at this late date. I'm very pleased to have the chance to share our work with you. I'm going to jump past the historical preamble and methods to the data. This is a team effort involving 2 anthropologists, a geographer, and an economist. Sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. But anyway, we have been working with NSF funding for the past 4 years on measuring poverty and rural inequality in 2 regions in Tanzania across 4 districts, 20 villages total. We've been working since 2009, and this is part of an effort to assess the impact of the rural titling, land titling program that was rolled out in 2004. So we've had now almost a decade of some people having rural property titles, some being completely excluded from the program, and others now just getting it. So we're able to do a cross-sectional study and hope to get funding to do a longitudinal study. So I'll jump right in to some of the data. We employed both quantitative and qualitative methods. In our quantitative data, we have roughly 50 households in 20 villages. Average village size is between 3,000 to 5,000 households. This allows us a margin of error of under 15%, and we would go back to people who had particularly compelling stories to do semi-structured interviews for the qualitative angle. In addition, we did qualitative interviews with all kinds of personnel related to this program: bankers, NGOs, civil society organizations, officials from the government, the World Bank employees associated with the project because they're a major donor. And we made sure to to get good samples of pastoralists as well as farmers. We even got hunter-gatherers and a significant share of women. We got 57% of our survey of 1,022 households was women. So here's the broad statistics here: 1,022 households across the 20 villages, 57% of which are responded by women. Average household size is 7 people in the household with an average of 2.5 income earners. So imputed income, we attempted, instead of looking at income, we took subsistence needs into account. One thing in rural areas that is very strong is people have strong memories of how much produce they produced and how much they consumed. It's very easy, instead of saying what's the value of everything you brought into the household, this question, most people look blankly at you, but they can say, I harvested 7 gunny sacks of 80 kilos of corn and 50 buckets of beans, et cetera, et cetera. And then you ask, how many did you consume? And we subtract for that and we get our imputed income. So unfortunately, the data is showing our village survey to be well below the international standard. Instead of $1 a day, our average is 25 cents per day per capita. And this varies, but not significantly so, across the villages. Our Lorenz curve is pretty dramatically bad. And here's the income distribution. Our Gini coefficients, we were talking yesterday about 68% in South Africa. We're at 73, 76% here in the regions where we're working. These 2 regions were selected because they both have combinations of cultivators and pastoralists, and they have different cash crops, but we have coffee regions, rice growing regions, and then largely subsistence corn regions. So Gini coefficients do range somewhat. Our lowest, I think, was 0.5652, and our highest around 0.86. So surprisingly unequal income distribution. It's worse in the coffee growing regions and the rice growing regions with the heavy cash crop production. We also looked at many aspects of causes of poverty, including marketing system, who they were selling to, whether they had access to subsidies through input vouchers. This is a program that was copied from the Malawi situation, where the idea was if you give people fertilizer, they can increase their yields. the availability of inputs and public goods, access to price supports, food aid, credit, and land holdings. We found landlessness, here's more or less the base because titling hasn't yet really taken off, at about 10%, but it is growing. In one of our districts, it was 30% landlessness. We found a fairly robust rental market. This is contrary to predictions of the proponents of titling. And in one village in Kiteto, where properties are large scale, 500 acres, there were very uniform prices for the rental markets. So here's our Gini coefficient for land ownership. And you see 68, 63%, although this varies in some areas. So this one outlier of 71% Gini coefficient in Kiteto. Kiteto is the former Maasai steppe, which was almost entirely and exclusively pastoralist. But this is where there's a lot of elite land grabbing occurring because of the assumption that, well, they haven't been farming over there, so the land must be virgin, fertile land. So you've got all this encroachment and high levels of conflict in the Maasai steppe. And the Gini coefficients, again, do range, but pretty high. The voucher system, about copying Malawi, we found to our great dismay that the wealthiest quartile are the ones who are getting the vouchers, not the poor. Finally, pricing in terms of access to markets. On average, people in our sample, because they are in distant rural areas, so we had some areas that were right on roads, they tended to have better market access, they therefore got better prices. But when you're in remote areas, you are dependent on middlemen coming to town and saying they're ready to buy your produce. People are getting between 50% of the market price up to 80%. And then here's the thing that we were searching for, because the rationale for titling in Tanzania is straight from Hernando de Soto's writings, the idea being that you can increase productivity if you increase security, that people are not investing as much as they can into their land because they're fearful of losing it. So by granting land titles, you increase their sense of security over their land, which will thereby increase productivity. It will also decrease conflict because everyone will know whose land is whose. It will increase access to credit for able to use the title as collateral. This, in turn, will lead to income generation activities of different kinds and reduce poverty, and that this will help women because their rights to land will be secure. And the silent agenda that only was verbalized this year for the first time since 2004 when this thing was rolled out is that, yes, this is an attempt by the government as well to build a tax base. So in our sample of 1,000 households, as of this point, only 71 households reported having a title. So we're still at the very early stages, and we did go to the district where it started, where everything began, and still we found that a lot of people, curiously, may have a title waiting for them in the village district office or district or village office, but many people are not collecting these because they have heard that once they do, they have to pay taxes. And so they are leaving them there and not collecting them. So 71 people out of 1,000, roughly, that had it. We also looked at access to credit in the absence of or with a title to be able to use as our benchmark as we go forward. And 86 people out of 842 respondents, I can't explain why some people didn't, oh no, out of 928 respondents answered this question and said that they did have a loan. So very low levels of indebtedness. When we asked what kind of loans they had, 4 people out of 80 reported having it from an NGO, 13 from a savings cooperative, 11 only from a bank, 11 out of the 80, 20 from neighbors, 27 from neighbors or family, and the other category is significant, 21 out of 80, that's a significant portion. We should delve deeper, and unfortunately I fear I know the answer to that question out of my interviews, and these are the new money lenders come to town in the absence of banks, who have highly usurious lending rates. And then there are rotating credit funds, which is primarily a female option. So here's the division between reality and theory. When we talk to villagers, they say, officials have told us that once you are issued with a certificate of occupancy, which is the rural title program, you can get a loan. So this is the common perception throughout all the areas where we went, where the World Bank team had done its awareness campaign and said, this is coming along the way, this is what's going to be the benefit to you, you'll be able to go get loans, is the thing that the villagers remember most. When we talked to bankers, though, we interviewed all the banks that are servicing the rural areas, and they said, almost in unison, we are not involved in farming, the risk is high, if there's no rain, their crops will fail, and they will not be able to pay back their loan. We thus have no interest in issuing loans on the basis of these rural titles. So we have not found that this theory of using these as collateral is in fact a reality. So when we looked at the people, and only 4 out of the 71 who have a title said they had successfully used that title to obtain a loan. 1 of the 4 got it from a bank. The other 1 got it from a savings cooperative, and the other 2 from other sources, which again, fear means these money lenders who are an increasing problem in villages. When asked now what people would use loans for, look at the highest answer is education, which is a serious problem. In my interviews with woman after woman after woman, it was disturbing to me how often women who didn't have titles, when I asked, do you want a title? Have you heard about this program? And they'd say, yes, 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 I want one. I'm like, why do you want one? You know, the survey result could say, it will make me feel more secure, I can stop my feud with my neighbor, or on and on. But they said, no, I want to be able to send my child to secondary school. You have to ask, what's the return on that investment? Because if you can't pay for year 1, how will you pay for year 2? And the terms of the loan being 3 years, what are we looking at if loans were available on the basis of this, and if they were not educational loans, then you're looking at possibilities of foreclosure. So a key argument in the rationale for titling is that there's a great deal of land insecurity, that titling will augment security and increase incentives to invest in land. And we ask questions, do you fear losing your land? And if so, by whom do you fear losing your land? So here's the results on that. Do you worry about your land being taken away from you? 500 out of nearly 900 people said no. 342 out of the sample said yes. Now that's not insignificant. 40% of people are reporting some fear of losing their land, but the majority, in fact, are saying no. When we broke this down, we found that people felt more insecure after the World Bank had come to town and said, we're here to provide you with security. We have a direct correlation. Insecurity rises once the team comes to town. So we also found a negative relationship between education, land ownership, and security, that large landowners feel greater insecurity. Also do people with higher levels of education. And then that having the land title was, in fact, not a significant variable. Now, that can change over time. Remember, our land title holders community is very still small. The main drivers seem to be the fixed effects of villages. Which village do you live in? Insecurity is not uniform. And in fact, if you're a village that's on the periphery to a national park, you have high levels of insecurity almost by definition, because the worst land grabber in the country are the national parks. They're forever pushing the boundaries and modifying their maps. And also, if you have a village with large levels of pastoralists mixed with farmers, there's going to be contests over how the land ought to be used in the village, and you'll have high levels of insecurity there as well. And then if you're proximate to foreign land investors, there tends to be high levels of insecurity there too. So it really is a factor of where the villages are and what's the particular history of that village. So we looked at, I already said that. So yeah, fixed effects, if you're neighboring large-scale holdings, conservation areas, or have high mixtures of pastoralists and agriculturalists, these are the villages that have high levels of insecurity. Finally, we asked, if you could control government resources the way you control your own household resources, and we all have to decide what are we going to spend money on this year in terms of school fees, food, etc., where would titling stand relative to other priorities? We asked the question, if you could put #1 priority, what would you ask the government to spend money on? Titling falls last out of 5 categories. The first is water, second is health, third is education, fourth is roads, and then comes titling. And here, back to our gender situation, the evidence seems to yield that this is, in fact, causing the mass dispossession of women's land rights, contrary to the theory that this is going to improve women's participation in land ownership. In fact, when we ask people, is your spouse included in your application? Now, so this, we have a 520 number of respondents here, because although we have only 70 with titles in hand, people are in the process of getting them. So we have people who've completed the application process and are awaiting them. Out of 520 respondents, only 11 said that they had included their spouse on the application. Now I can break this, I'll have to break this down for gender, because 57% of our sample was women. So that could go the other way, that only 11 people are including their spouse, be they a husband or a wife. But even when we look at the lists of who has the titles and the applications, male name follows male name, follows male name, follows male name. So back to our top selling points on what the literature tells us, that this increased security, increased productivity, decreased conflict, access to credit, poverty reduction, and female empowerment. We're finding rather disturbing results on almost all these scores. So in conclusion, our survey indicates that perceptions of insecurity and conflict are associated with the titling process. Now, advocates of titling do say that you have to expect conflict at the get-go, but you expect it to rise suddenly as the boundaries are being set, but then you will expect a layering, a leveling off of that. So perhaps we're still, the proponents might say we're still in this early phase. We have to expect that there will be more conflict now. And we have, in fact, found that. There are higher levels of conflict than compared to previous times. And higher levels of insecurity. To date, there is no evidence of loans being given out. We said one person got a bank loan out of the 70 who had CCROs. Only 9.2% of all households in the sample have access to formal credit, mostly through microcredit. And that was, I'm sorry, credit overall, which includes family sources. The majority, as you saw, are very, very, very poor. We're worried about the effect on women's land rights being a negative one instead of a positive gain. And that the fact that this does not seem to be addressing rural villagers' concerns begs the question of whether this is the best use, best use of government funds. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.